but I think we can go ahead and get started here. Let's get my screen to move to, there we go. All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's webinar. My name is Eleanor Rangers, and I'm the president of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Cold War Historical Society. We've actually been in existence since 2010 and dedicated to preserving the history of memories of those who created it in the Southeastern Pennsylvania area and focused on the Cold War with a secondary focus on the space race. This is our ongoing History in Our Backyard webinar series, of course. And do want to just have a general reminder, if you are not receiving emails from us and you have previously, please check your spam folder. I did fairly recently switch over our email notification system for programming, so it may have triggered those emails to go into your spam. So just a heads up to that. Also, just wanted to mention, for a while, we have mentioned that an easy way, if you so choose, to make a donation to our organization is through Amazon Smile. They are actually, or are in the process of discontinuing that program this year. So unfortunately, that will no longer be available. But again, if you so choose to donate to our organization, we do have a donate button conveniently on our website for your consideration. So I just wanted to mention that. And donations, of course, are always welcome. One of the things we are getting ready to finally put together, and I'm finishing up the signage as we speak, is a display room that will be on Naval Air Development Center history that will be placed at the Fuse just inside the front entrance. We have a small room available for that purpose. So stay tuned for that, coming soon. I've been a little slower than I anticipated in getting that up and running, but we're in the finalization stages of that, so I'm pretty excited when we can formally unveil that. Also, we do record these sessions and we do make them available on our YouTube channel, which is under the name of our organization. I try to get those up fairly soon after the programs have concluded. We do also try to update the channel apart from these webinars with other content as we come across it. So it's definitely worthwhile checking that out periodically. We also do have a presence on Facebook. I do try to basically put some various news articles that I may come across related to Cold War space race history up there, and also the announcements for these programs as well. So would encourage you to check us out on Facebook. As per usual, I do always ask that during the presentation, if you could mute yourselves and turn off your cameras just to preserve bandwidth. That's always helpful as a great courtesy to our presenters. This is the programs we had and do have scheduled for 2023. This evening, of course, will be John Ramirez, who I'll introduce in a moment. Next month, we have Robert Hopkins talking about the TIL-2 missions, which I'm eagerly looking forward to as well. And then several other programs for the balance of 2023. And I already have a number of programs slated for 2024 that we'll get announcements about towards the back end of this year. As I mentioned, August will be a presentation on the TIL-2 spy missions. Definitely looking forward to that from a fairly well-renowned Cold War historian, Robert Hopkins. Also, I know I've had folks ask, when are you going to have live programs at the Fuse? We are going to have a live event coming up in September. Former NADC alum Franz Bond is actually going to be speaking about the topic of personal interest to Franz. That is about his personal story as a worker coming to the United States, and in many respects, it's also a wonderful story of the American dream and coming here to actually realize that and make a real contribution as a U.S. citizen. So that will be a live event. That will be on September 14th. So please mark your calendars. And looking forward to seeing some of you in person that evening. I am going to try to do a live simulcast of that. We have figured out how to do that from the Fuse. So That will also be a first. So I'm definitely looking forward to making that happen for those unable to attend in person. So without further ado, let's go ahead and introduce our guest speaker this evening, John Ramirez. Now, John is a former CIA officer who worked for 25 years in the intelligence community. He served within the Directorate of Science and Technology, the Directorate of Intelligence, and the National Counterproliferation Center, among other duties and accolades within his career. John graced us with a wonderful talk last year, and we have him returning this year to discuss some technical operations aspects in the Shah's Iran. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to John. I'm going to exit my program and turn the screen over to John. So welcome, John.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me bring up the slideshow presentation in presenter format. Okay, so today's topic is about the TACKSMAN listening posts in Iran. And this was the era of Cold War before we actually had a mature satellite constellation taking pictures and collecting signals. A lot of our technical collection capabilities were on the ground or in the air or at sea. And so I'm going to begin with an overview of what we had arrayed against the Soviet Union in order to collect against the ballistic missile tests they were conducting in the interior of the country. Again, this is just a little bit about my background. I was in the Second Operations Office in the Directorate of Science and Technology, which became Technical Collection. And then I was in the Office of Scientific and Weapons Research and its successor office, where we did most of the analysis of the ballistic missiles the Soviet Union was developing, as well as other countries such as the People's Republic of China. And ended my career with the National Counterproliferation Center in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, where the focus is mostly on preventing the spread of WMD to these other countries. Most of the information used to be classified, but much of it has been declassified of late. And these are the sources that I used in order to put together this presentation. Now let's start with what the collection site locations were back in the 1950s. As you know, after World War II, we had our German rocket scientists, and the Soviet Union had their German rocket scientists, and they started developing ballistic missile capabilities. When they first started, we recognized the signals associated with their missile tests because these signals were exactly the same signals that our German rocket scientists were using. So it was very easy to detect the fact that they too were developing their own ballistic missiles based on the German V2 rocket. And originally we had several countries surrounding the Soviet Union. As you can see here, Turkey, we had in the US, Alaska, Iran, which is tonight's topic, Pakistan, Japan, and I just want to go back one. Those that are redacted are actually, you see air. And when this slide was first developed back in 1959, the existence of the U-2 was highly classified. So what you see is redactions under air for Turkey, Japan, and Pakistan were U-2s. Now, in this map of the Soviet Union, this is the more recent map, which shows Russia, but back when it was the Soviet Union, we had several collection facilities arrayed against them, including Norway in the north. We had Turkey, we had Iran, Pakistan, Japan, and our own US Air Force and US Navy collectors in the North Pacific area. And the reason why we had these were these are the locations that were most optimally positioned to collect against their missile launch and impact points. And this is actually a Russian map showing where they launched and where they impacted. So you can see it's pretty self-explanatory that they would launch from the western part of the Soviet Union, and they would impact on the eastern part of the Soviet Union as far east as the Kamchatka Peninsula. And so if we recall, we had collectors up in Norway, we had collectors in Turkey, Iran, in Pakistan, in Japan, and in the Northern Pacific area. And the reason why is because, as you can see, this is the optimal position for collecting the signals associated with their ballistic missile tests. Now, in Norway, we had the Norwegian Intelligence Service as a liaison. We had ground sites in northern Norway, as you can see from the radomes that you see on the left side. And they also had a ship called the Majarta. We called it Monica, but the Norwegians call it Majarta. It's an electronic spy ship arrayed against the Soviet submarine launched ballistic missiles in the Barents Sea. In Turkey, we liaison with the Air Force in a place called Diyarbakir, and we had 2 radars there to track against the missiles as they were flying from west to east. And you can see on the lower left side a illustration of why those radars were there. They were able to put up what we call an electronic fence across the horizon, and also not only in azimuth, but also in elevation. We can track their missiles as they traverse the sky onto their impact points. And our own collectors, we had an RC-135S aircraft called Cobra Ball. On board Cobra Ball was a camera system known as the real-time optics system, which actually could take very good photographs and videos of the missiles in flight as they were reaching their impact points on the Kamchatka Peninsula. We also had a ship, the Navy administered, the observation island, and on board were several radars, including the Cobra Judy radar, which was operated by the US Air Force on board this Navy ship. And the Air Force had this large radar called Cobra Dane on Shimya Island, Alaska. And on the little globe map on the lower right-hand side, you can see the dark area, which was the angular coverage of the Cobra Dane. But within like 60 degrees of that area was the high quality tracking, which is right over the Kamchatka Peninsula. And this radar is still in operation today. The Cobra Ball Boeing RC-135 aircraft is still in operation today. And the observation island is no longer operating, but there is a replacement ship that is being built. Today, we have everything in digital, but back then, everything was analog, much like on our entertainment side of things, where we had analog tape. Today, we are able to, on demand, grab a movie from Netflix digitally. Before, we had to go to the VCR store and rent a VCR tape, if you remember those days. So even back then, of course, we had magnetic tape on these Honeywell 96 instrumentation recorders, and a lot of hardware with patch cords and analog receivers to collect the signals. And of course, these receivers were attached to very large dish antennas. Now they were recorded and then shipped back to the continental US, where various analysis laboratories within the intelligence community and with our contractors were able to analyze the recordings of the signals emanated by these Soviet ballistic missiles. And 2 of our pioneering contractors were HRB in State College and ESL in Palo Alto, California. Both were founded by Penn State alumni, and that was the subject of my previous talk for the Historical Society. A little bit of technical information. There's this field called signals intelligence, or SIGINT. And it's divided into three subcategories of comment, which is probably the most understandable. It's communications intelligence. That's like voice collection. And FISINT is what we're going to talk about, foreign instrumentation intelligence. And that's basically telemetry data transmitted by the ballistic missiles. And ELINT, which is electronic intelligence, and that is the collection and analysis of radar signals that might be tracking the ballistic missiles in flight. The very first program in Iran was called Eggshell. Now, going back to the previous slide, where we talked about two areas of signals intelligence. One was comment or communications intelligence, and the other was foreign instrumentation signals intelligence, or telemetry signals. And we were able to detect them from a place called Kapustin Yar Missile Test Range. And we discovered that in northern Iran, it was optimally positioned to collect those signals from Kapustin Yar. The Shah of Iran offered a hunting palace that he had in a city called Bashar to house a temporary SIGINT facility, which we named Eggshell. And this Eggshell facility collected telemetry associated with the Ballistic Missile Research and Development Program. In addition, the Eggshell facility discovered, as they were tracking these missiles in flight, that the Russians were tracking their own missiles in flight using their own radar. So that was a bonus collection of radar signals as they were reflected off of the missiles in flight. And that particular program, where we collected radar signals being reflected by the ballistic missiles, that was called Project Melody. Eventually, TACKSMAN grew out of the original Eggshell program. Okay, so a recap of where TACKSMAN locations were. First, let's look at where Kapustin Yar is. It's up in here, above the Caspian Sea. And they would launch missiles to the west, which would land at Sarashigan Missile Impact Area, their equivalent of White Sands. For long-range missiles going toward the Kamchatka Peninsula in the northern Pacific, they would launch from the Tyuratam Missile Test Range. And TACKSMAN I and later TACKSMAN II were located in northern Iran at this location for TACKSMAN I on the Caspian Sea, and up in the remote mountains of northern Iran, TACKSMAN II. And keep in mind that what are now independent republics were once part of the Soviet Union. So Turkmenistan was once the Soviet Socialist Republic, as well as Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and the other countries in the western part of the Soviet Union. They were all part of the Soviet Union, and now they're independent countries. So this is a picture of the TACKSMAN I site, and the building you see was the Shah of Iran's hunting palace, and he allowed us to build some hardware on it. You can see on the right picture, you can see a radome next to his hunting palace, and along the compound of the hunting palace, we built some quarters for personnel. So at TACKSMAN I, the families were allowed to accompany the personnel from the intelligence community collecting these signals. So they had accommodations and amenities, and the personnel lived with their families on the Shah's palace grounds. In 1959, around that time, the Soviet Union built the Tyuratam Missile Test Range. And so TACKSMAN, when it accompanied or when it took on the Tyuratam Missile Test Range target, became TACKSMAN I, because what happened was that we built a second site. Here's an overview of TACKSMAN I site, image as recently as this year on February 17, 2023. It is still intact. It is still operating, not by us, by probably Iranians And here's a close-up of the radome and some dish antennas for TACKSMAN I, and just a generic picture of a radome and what a dish inside would look like. So the radome is there as mostly as environmental protection. It's temperature controlled. And so the radome, as we can see in this photograph that was taken by unclassified commercial imagery that you can find on Google Earth, that imagery shows that the radome itself is inflated, which means in all intents and purposes that this site is still operational. Now we come to TACKSMAN II. As you can see, there's nothing around TACKSMAN II. It is built on a mountain ridge and very rugged terrain, and the assignments were unaccompanied. So personnel that were assigned to TACKSMAN II were not allowed to bring their families. There are absolutely no way to accommodate families at such a remote location. And this TACKSMAN II site was imaged on July 7, 2022. And again, as you can see, it's still a viable site. There's still activity there. The radomes are still inflated. As you can see, TACKSMAN II is a much larger site than TACKSMAN I. My understanding is that there are other radomes built since the Americans left in 1979. Other radomes have been built. So that gives us a clue that the Iranians are still maintaining this site for themselves. And from the TACKSMAN II era, here are two radomes that were used for signals collection. And as you can see, there's something that looks like an observatory that was an optical collector. From TACKSMAN II, it was very easy to see the missiles as they were traversing the sky. And not only were they able to collect signals, they were also able to image them and photograph these missiles and take a film of these missiles as they were traversing the sky. So we had a lot of good information about what the missiles look like and what the missile complex looked like as it was crossing the sky from TACKSMAN II. Now, speaking about telemetry, as I said, the Soviet rocket scientists received a lot of technology from the German rocket scientists who worked on the V2. And a lot of the original telemetry packages placed on these missiles to monitor the performance of the missiles were very similar to what our German rocket scientists provided us. So we were able to understand the early test programs conducted by the Soviet German rocket scientists. And this illustration shows some of the instrumented data that was transmitted by the telemetry signal. And I'll get into exactly what I mean by a telemetry signal in the next slide. But there were many, many components in a missile, and every one of those components needed to have some kind of monitoring. How well is it doing? Is it within specs? How is it performing? And all of those data were transmitted as radio signals back to the ground. And it's those radio signals that our collectors were able to record on analog tape and then ship stateside to our laboratories in the intelligence community and with our primary contractors. So basically, we were able to peek over the shoulders of the Soviet rocket scientists as they were developing their missiles, because we were able to understand what the signals were telling their rocket scientists is the same signals telling us, our rocket scientists, how the missile was performing. Now, this is the only technical slide I have to explain telemetry. Basically, telemetry is a radio signal that varies in voltage over time. And so if you look at the first illustration, and these are just simplified illustrations, if you look at the first illustration on the left, excuse me, our first stage main engine fuel burn rate, as you can see, at launch time, you would suspect that the first stage will have a full tank of fuel. But as launch occurred, that fuel will be expended at some kind of linear rate as it empties over a period of time. And so they were able to determine the rate of that fuel burn, and then determined, because they had images of these rockets as they were taking off from their launch sites, they were able to image them. They know about what size those fuel tanks might be, and they were able to estimate how much fuel that missile could carry. And then at a certain time, you have main engine cutoff known as MECO that would occur, and it might be a spike or a series of spikes or pulses sent back to the ground. And then what happens next after the main engine cuts off and drops away, the secondary engine would then start. So SCS is secondary engine start, and you might see spikes again, signifying that the secondary engine started. Now, on the right side, you'll see another graph illustrating a full tank. So obviously, when the first stage lit off at launch, the second stage had its full tank. And when the second stage burned all of its fuel and dropped off, the full tank would then start being used as the secondary engine started. And then the secondary engine will then gradually expend all of its fuel until you have secondary engine cutoff. So you imagine all of these indicators being transmitted as radio signals, and those radomes were those large dishes at TACKSMAN II and at TACKSMAN I being able to collect these signals, and then the analysts will be able to break out exactly what those signals mean and what does the signal signify in terms of performance of the ballistic missile. So that is a simplified explanation of missile telemetry. So some of the things that telemetry could reveal, there are basically like 5 major things you want to know about a ballistic missile. And first, of course, is range. How far can the ballistic missile reach? What is its maximum range? How fast can the missile fly, which is its velocity? Throw weight is how heavy a warhead or warheads can the ballistic missile put into flight, and that is known as throw weight. Yield is how powerful is the nuclear payload? How many kilotons or megatons can this particular missile then carry to its target, deliver to its target, and that's known as yield. And accuracy is actually termed as circular error probability, which I have another illustration to describe that. But basically, if you can imagine, if you're an archer, you're on an archery range, you have your bow and arrow, and you shoot, let's say, 20 arrows toward your target, and you count like how close are the first closest 10 arrows to the bullseye. And that radius is known as the circular error probability. It's the bullseye accuracy. So in this illustration, you have like a bullseye, and you have like several shots at the bullseye, but only a certain number of them were about 50% of the shots. And so you measure from the center of the bullseye out to where you encompass that 50% number. So if you have 20, how far out did you get at least 10 of those arrows to hit your bullseye? So in missile talk, that's known as circular error probability. And over a period of time, we were able to tell just from the telemetry how accurate the Soviets were in hitting a target. And back then, the accuracy was measured in hundreds of meters. And I can say in an unclassified environment that now it's tens of meters. Some of the targets collected by TACKSMAN II back in the day were the major missiles targeted against the United States. And these are the ICBM class missiles with intercontinental range. They were tested from a site called Plesetsk, and the other site I already mentioned, Tyuratam, and they impacted on the Kamchatka Peninsula. SS-17 Spanker, the SS-18 Satan, so aptly named because it was the most dangerous missile and the most powerful missile ever developed by the Soviet Union back during the Cold War, and this SS-19 Stiletto. In addition to these intercontinental missiles, the Soviets also tested shorter range missiles, not particularly to test the missile itself, but to test certain payloads or to simulate certain types of attack profiles. Now, the SS-20 Sabre was launched at full range. It's an intermediate range ballistic missile, and it was launched from Kapustin Yar to Sari-Shagan, which is about 2,200, I think 2,200 kilometers. And so it was launched at full range, and it could hit any target in NATO from its deployment sites within like minutes, like 5 to 10 minutes. So it was very dangerous missile for them to have. We developed the Pershing II missile as a counter. We also developed some ground-launched cruise missiles with nuclear warheads as a counter to the SS-20. All of these weapon systems were banned by the IRBM treaty, which so far the current Russian government has adhered to. So they're banned, and they're no longer intermediate range ballistic missiles being deployed by the United States or by Russia today. Now, the SLA-J was actually a space rocket. It launched satellites, but they also used this space launch vehicle to simulate US ICBM attacks. They would launch it, and then they would continue, instead of having the stage drop off, it would continue to go up into space and then tilt back down toward the Earth in something called a lofted trajectory. So it'll come back down at a very, very steep angle. And so we were able to work back the angle that these SLA-Js would fly toward their target, and then actually trace them back to various ICBM sites in the United States. So we can say, oh, this one's from Maelstrom Air Force Base. It's simulating a Minuteman missile from Maelstrom. So that's how we use the SLA-J data. And the SS-4 was used to develop their own reentry vehicles, and I'll describe a reentry vehicle next, and also develop ballistic missile countermeasures. These were countermeasures that they thought would confuse our ability to detect the constitution of their missile strike, the number of missiles and where their impact points might be in order to delay our response. So they used SS-4 to test various countermeasures and also to test various warhead designs, various reentry vehicles. So this is a reentry vehicle. On the left side is the actual reentry vehicle for the SS-18 Satan ICBM. The hard, very hard metallic object is the actual reentry vehicle. And you'll see a much softer, kind of aluminum looking, very soft target. And when it's inflated, it served as a decoy. So the SS-18 carried not only reentry vehicles with nuclear warheads, but also carried decoys in order to prevent us from determining where the attack might be impacting. And on the right is an unclassified view of a thermonuclear warhead cutaway. It's also known as a peanut. Now, altogether, we call it a physics package because this is where nuclear physics happens in order for the nuclear detonation to take place. And we also call it a peanut because it's shaped like a peanut. And both the Russian and US warheads are shaped like peanuts. And in fact, there's an infamous picture of Kim Jong-un with a North Korean nuclear warhead, and it's also shaped like a peanut. So whatever they designed at Los Alamos back in the day, everyone copied. Now let's look at ICBM launch to impact. These are the stages of an ICBM launch event that the TACKSMAN II site was able to collect. First, you have the upper stage of reentry, which is like the second stage, now cutting off, and then it would detach what's known as a post-boost vehicle. Basically, it had rockets on it, and it also had reentry vehicles on it, and it would go up into the sky, into space, and eventually it would maneuver and release its reentry vehicles in blue, as you see there. In addition to reentry vehicles, which are colored blue in this illustration, it would also release decoys. And in this illustration, they're colored white. So now you have both decoys and reentry vehicles. And of course, we're more interested in the reentry vehicle, not the decoys. But look at all the targets that it will put up to confuse our ability to detect exactly where the warheads are. And in addition, at the very apogee, we're talking like anywhere from 700 miles up to 1,000 miles. It literally went up into space above the orbits of many satellites. And so this is why TACKSMAN was able to then orient its dish antennas up towards space to collect all of the telemetry that was being downlinked to the Russian rocket scientists on the ground. Now we have these orange objects here that is known as chaff. And chaff was developed during World War II. Is basically, well, all intents and purposes, metallic objects thrown out to provide extra targets for radar and to cloud any presence of a reentry vehicle, and then also prevented us from determining which are the decoys. So you have all of this chaff accompanying these decoys and the real reentry vehicles with the warheads all together with the post-boost vehicle on its way down. It's a big mess to try to sort out. And so together they're called the missile complex. But because the telemetry signals were transmitted by the reentry vehicles themselves, not necessarily the decoys, and definitely not the chaff, we're able to determine which were the actual reentry vehicles with the warheads. And of course, they were using dummy warheads for these tests. And you see this red area here, which is the post-boost vehicle entering the atmosphere and burning up. And there you have 4 of the reentry vehicles impacting to its target. And these reentry vehicles would come in at 8 kilometers per second. Translated into miles, it's 5 miles every second. And so past, I would say past apogee at the peak, these reentry vehicles will fly at 5 miles per second, which is extremely fast. It's much faster than any missile in the US inventory today can hit. So we are not able to hit any reentry vehicles using Patriot. It was not designed to test against ICBM class reentry vehicles with warheads. They're developing something, the Navy is using the Standard Missile 3 in a ballistic missile mode to try to have enough kinetic force, kinetic velocity to be able to go after these reentry vehicles. But Putin himself has boasted that his missiles can't be hit by anything in the US inventory, and he's absolutely correct. They cannot. This is what our reentry vehicles look like. This is from an older missile that has been decommissioned. It was called the LGM-118 Peacekeeper missile. It was developed during the Reagan administration, and it was since decommissioned by the Bush administration. So you have these 8 targets coming from a Peacekeeper ICBM toward Kwajalein Atoll, where we would test our ICBM reentry vehicles. The Soviets, we determined, were trying to simulate what you're seeing on this slide, what an attack would look like from our ICBMs. And they would again use the SS-4 and the SLA-J space launch vehicle to try to simulate a reentry vehicle impact so that they can better tune their ballistic missile defenses against our missiles. So this is let me go back one, skipped ahead. And this is an old anti-ballistic missile interceptor that was used to protect Moscow. There were several of these sites ringing Moscow during the Cold War. The radar itself was called Triad, which was collected by TACKSMAN. And the ABM launch tube at Sarashagan, when they launched the interceptor, it too had telemetry packages, and we were able to detect the signal from the ABM interceptor and could determine the performance of the interceptor, and then extrapolate what that interceptor could do against a US reentry vehicle in case there was a World War III situation and we would launch against Moscow. we were able to determine how effective their interceptors might be against our attack. That in itself was able to inform our nuclear warfighting plan, which was once called the SIOP, the Single Integrated Operation Plan for a nuclear war against the Soviet Union. So we were able to then counter their counter. And so the way we were able to detect their radar signals, such as the triad radar shown in the previous slide, the Soviets would then transmit the radar signal and track their reentry vehicle, track their missile complex themselves. And of course, it being their radar, they're able to receive their own reflections from the targets that they were tracking. So as they were doing that, the radar signals will bounce off the reentry vehicle and back toward the ground. Now, we won't get the strong main beam returns from reflected by the reentry vehicle back to the Soviet radar, but we're able to get some side lobes from their radar. So we get able to get reflections much weaker, but however, we were able to still discern the signal characteristics, the signal parameters, and do analysis on their radar signals using something called bistatic electronic intelligence collection, or bistatic ELINT. Bistatic meaning that we have a monostatic situation on the Russian side where they have one receiver, but our receiver that the Russians were not able to tell was activating because it's just received. There's no signal coming out of a receiver. We're able to then collect against their radar without having to fly over that radar or being close to the radar. Now we're getting toward the end of our presentation. As you know, there was political instability in late 1978. The Shah's regime was highly unstable and was facing a lot of opposition. A lot of Iranians from the wealthy and influential elite families began an exodus out of the country. Many of the junior officers in the Iranian military sympathized with the revolutionary fervor against the regime. And so the Ayatollah Khomeini ended his exile in Paris and returned to Iran with strong popular support after the Shah left. And when the Shah left in self-exile, for all intents and purposes, the TACKSMAN program ended. We had no more sponsorship from the Ayatollah's government to continue these sites. TACKSMAN I personnel were evacuated in January '79. However, as you remember, TACKSMAN II personnel were sitting on top of a mountain, and they were repatriated later in March '79, and they were in such a remote region, they were basically cut off from communications. The Washington Post was able to then document that fact in a March 2, 1979 article. That is the date that the American technicians from TACKSMAN II was able to board aircraft from not the Air Force, but Air France. They were able to leave Tehran and land in Paris. And they were interviewed by members of the press, and they said they were very well treated, but there were some anxious moments because various militia groups would form and would go up to the site, and some of them were mistreating the Americans there. But the Khomeini's government was able to send their forces and able to secure the American technicians and bring them to safety. This all occurred before the Iranian hostage taking. This all happened in secret, that there were actual CIA officers, NSA officers at TACKSMAN II. And it wasn't until later that it leaked out that these were not just American technicians, but they were actual intelligence officers representing CIA and NSA. And that information leaked out from a member of Congress by the name of Senator Gary Hart of Colorado, who had presidential aspirations back then. And he let out that there were CIA officers at a listening post in northern Iran. And because he said that, that really infuriated many of the Iranians who were pro-revolutionary Iranians in favor of Khomeini. And so they occupied the embassy and then found the documents. As you remember, they were trying to shred a lot of documents, but they meticulously put together these fragments of documents, and they were able to determine and document the fact that CIA personnel were at TACKSMAN II. And that's what led primarily to all of the downfall of any relationship, any goodwill that we garnered originally from the recovery and repatriation of TACKSMAN II personnel by the Khomeini government. That was all gone by that point. And it's been a adversarial relationship ever since. Now, while TACKSMAN was an ongoing program, it did a lot of many things that were unique. First of all, it was the only place where we could detect the firing of the missile's first stage. And we were able to then determine missile throw weight, the total weight of the warheads lofted by the missile from TACKSMAN. We also were able to intercept the voice communications of the Soviet rocket scientists and the Soviet missile personnel conducting the test. 85% of everything we ever learned about the Soviet missile program during the Cold War came from TACKSMAN. And the loss of TACKSMAN program in 1979 was mitigated by what we have today, which is space-based reconnaissance. And it matured during the 80s, and now it's a very mature program. Let me go back one more. The National Reconnaissance Office is responsible for the satellite program to collect intelligence of our adversaries overseas. And so with this program, we no longer need these ground sites. We no longer overfly the Soviet Union, or we no longer overfly Russia with any kind of aircraft that could be vulnerable to a surface-to-air missile. We're now able to collect these signals and get the same kind of intelligence using satellites. And so that's the end, and I'd be happy to take any questions at this point.
Wow, that was great. I have a ton of questions, but I don't want to hog the floor. So I'm going to see if anyone has any questions. Anyone want to start? Otherwise, I'd be happy to ask the first question.
Okay.
All right, let's see. Well, first of all, just a comment. I found it ironic that the Shah gave the U.S. use of his hunting palace for us to hunt satellites or hunt ballistic missiles. I found that rather ironic.
I'm sure, yes, I'm sure he had more than one palace. He had many, many palaces.
Yeah, so it wasn't
Sure.
that big of a deal. One question I had, and you answered part of it with the revolution in 1979, how much, when we had to just abandon that, did we destroy anything? Well, you said things were shredded, but then repieced together in the embassy, but on site, were we able to get rid of certain things so that, I guess I'm just trying to find out how much intelligence or capabilities did we end up leaving behind that obviously may still be in use today by Iran?
What the site destroyed were documents.
Okay.
The documents are more important than actually hardware. The hardware is fairly generic. You can buy these receivers, you can build a dish antenna. Everything in the hardware side was pretty much off the shelf, commercial off the shelf, but it was the software used, it was the publications that we had, our knowledge of the Soviet missile program. That type of information was destroyed, and that was thoroughly shredded. And my understanding, having spoke with, when I first joined CIA, I had colleagues there who actually were at these TACKSMAN sites and were part of the evacuation of TACKSMAN II, and they said they burned everything they could. And so they left the equipment intact. basically there was very little time. I mean, there was like time was of the essence. So they had a big job just getting rid of all the documentation and the communications equipment. The most important thing is the coding equipment, because they would send coded messages back to the embassy and back to stateside from TACKSMAN II. So the encryption capabilities that we had, the cyber capabilities that we had were very sensitive.
Hmm.
So we destroyed all the codes and everything. That was more important than the hardware.
Yeah. What monitoring, if anything, did we make out of Iran during the early space race? You know, I'm thinking like Gagarin's flight, for example. Did we monitor any of that or detect any of that?
And there were many sites collecting against the space program. And so you also have Turkey as well. And you had Norway. We also had Germany. Germany didn't collect so much against the missile program. They were too far away, but they were able to keep communications. So when the Soviets asked the Soviet cosmonauts would communicate back to their ground stations over the Soviet Union or to their ships at sea, which had very large dish antennas, we were able to collect that. We were able to piggyback off of that from various locations, such as in Japan and such as in Pakistan. So there were other ways to, other than the actual ballistic missile or the rocket launching Gagarin, there were other ways to then monitor the progress of the Soviet space program.
I have one other one, and then we'll open up the lines again. Anyone who may have questions. So it's pretty obvious from that one image, the one slide you showed at the beginning, about essentially we had a ring of monitoring stations around the Soviet Union. But where is Russia, or today China? Where are they? Or I'm assuming we know kind of where they're positioning or did position monitoring stations, because I'm thinking, what are they putting anything up in like northern Canada? I mean, where are they doing monitoring of us? Other, I mean, Cuba, obviously, I can see that, but I'm just curious.
Everyone has satellites.
Okay.
So everyone has electro-optical satellites taking photographs, and everyone has signals intelligence satellites collecting communications, radar signals, and other types of signals. So, the era of these ground-based sites are long gone. And the ground-based sites we have are basically downlink sites. That is, the satellite will downlink information to these bases. Ours are in the middle of Australia, in Alice Springs, Australia, and also in Northern England and Yorkshire, Menwith Hill, RAF Menwith Hill base. We have two huge facilities there. And in fact, in your introductory slide showing me in this presentation, you have many radomes behind you. That reminded me of what's at RAF Menwith Hill, all of those radomes in Northern England. And so they're not collecting line of sight data anymore like we used to on the ground. They are looking straight up and waiting for a satellite to downlink its information down. And so basically they're like doing that. And also we have data link satellites that all they do is act as our hubs in space, much like you would extend your home network with various hubs around your house to expand the coverage. We would have satellites that all they do, they don't collect, but they just relay the signal from our spy satellites back to CONUS. So they'll eventually get back to a ground station, either in Australia, in Northern England, or in Aurora, Colorado, just south of Denver, Colorado, which is the third big major mission ground station. And so that's how we do it today. And the Russians and the Chinese are doing the same thing.
Back, historically, do we know where their ground monitoring stations were located? I'm just curious.
Yeah, we imaged all of them. We knew exactly where they were. And so more importantly, it's not where they are, it's mostly where their satellites are. Because what we would do is that we would get the orbital parameters of their spy satellites. And when they're over a sensitive area, such as China Lake or such as White Sands Missile Test Range, that we would shut down operations when we knew that they had either photographic or signals coverage of those areas, and we will all of a sudden go silent and cover everything up, wait for them to pass, and then start up again. So that was more important than finding out where they were. So we would fly over their territory, and we would leave it up to them to find out when we're flying, not help them in any way, shape, or form. So we didn't care too much about where they were. We just flew where we needed to fly with our satellites. And one time, I can say this story, one time in the, as you know, Russia has 11 time zones. And Kamchatka is like, in the Kamchatka Peninsula is like one of the furthest eastern time zones in Russia. And so they have still have impact areas there where they would test missiles, they would impact in Kamchatka, and they would have their own instrumentation there. They would have their own radars there. They would have cover things up. And then during the test, they would roll things out and expose them. Well, the commander of one of these facilities mistook the time change. He was supposed to go to either regular time or savings time, and whatever it was, he mistook it. He was 1 hour off. And because he was 1 hour off, he left everything open, and our satellite was flying right over, and we were able to image something that normally would be covered.
Oh, wow.
That's the games we play with them.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Anyone else with questions this evening for John? The quiet group this evening.
Yeah. And so I don't understand why why the Chinese use balloons.
I was gonna ask that.
For the life of me, I don't understand what that balloon was doing, because they have better ways of collecting against us using satellites. And we know that. We know, where the satellites were. And the balloon is a slow moving object, which is easily tracked and easily shot down, as we saw.
Yeah.
So I don't know why they use balloons. I mean, there was a time when the US used balloons at one time, prior to the U-2 program. We would launch balloons from Pakistan and let it drift over various areas of the Soviet Union, and then have them recover over Canada, for example. And so that program was a viable program back in the 1950s, until then we developed the U-2 and SR-71 and other capabilities, eventually satellites. Balloons, it doesn't make sense. So I don't know why the Chinese would launch a balloon as a spy.
Yeah, my personal opinion was it was just a provocative event, just to kind of irritate people, and basically I think just to say, hey, we did this, and frankly the US did nothing until it was off the coast.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
that's my view. But
it could be to see if we're watching, like, what is our reaction time? Do we even detect? Do we even care? There is a balloon, and apparently, based on press reports, many of these balloons were floated above the United States prior times, and we did nothing about it.
Yeah.
Here, probably, again, as I say, we know the balloon's up, so we know when to cover up. But in this case, the balloon lost altitude and became clearly visible with binoculars. And so it forced our attention to the balloon. So
yeah,
I kind of agree with you. That's maybe, it's provocative, just to, give us a little poke.
Yeah, exactly. I did think it was kind of funny, though, that after that, when they started really looking at certain altitudes, and then there were things shot down that were like, it was the local weather club's balloon that was floating above Alaska. I found that kind of funny. But anyway, all right. Any questions? My gosh, I can't believe we're so quiet this evening.
Hey, Eleanor, this is Virginia Brooke.
Hey, how are you?
I'm just fine. How are you tonight?
Very good.
So, John, thank you very much. This was very informative. I honestly didn't think it would be interesting to me, but you presented it in a way that I could understand it, so thank you. But my question to you is, once the missile was fired, what height would it have to be before our radar would pick up that it had been launched?
Well, we are able to see the signal much further than line of sight radar. Radar is restricted by line of sight, and so from TACKSMAN II, we had no radars there. It was all electro-optical telescopes or signals. We did have a radar at the site Diyarbakir in Turkey, and they were able to see a little past, right around where the first stage of the missile would drop off. It would have to reach that height in order for it to see it. And then it can track it until it was past the highest point apogee, a little bit past that. And it was able to see the warheads drop off at that point. But then it will lose it because then it was too far to the east and below the horizon, below the earth. So it literally could not see it. The signals, however, would travel further than the radar signal coming back down, because they would transmit at various locations across the Soviet Union. They would have these other monitoring stations along the flight path of that missile underneath it. And because they were downlinking from space, from 700 to 1,000 miles up, they were downlinking back to the ground, not just at one point, but everywhere toward the impact point, where they had many opportunities to collect the telemetry signals. But for radar, it was very limited. It was just partially the arc, the actual missile flight. That's why we arrayed the our own assets in the Northern Pacific. So we had an aircraft, Cobra Ball, that could fly off in international waters and actually see the missiles impact into Kamchatka. We had the Cobra Judy radar at the impact point where we can see where Turkey left off, we could pick up from that ship and see the rest of the flight coming back down. And the Cobra Dane radar also from Alaska, that also could then overlap with the Turkey radar and could see the rest of the flight. It could not detect the impact, but it could see most of the flight. But we relied on our aircraft, the Cobra Ball aircraft and the Cobra Judy ship for the rest of the information going back toward the impact point.
Okay, great. Thank you.
I know you had mentioned about our capability, I guess our anti-missile capabilities, and that we really do not have that capability against the Russians. And I'm not sure whether we do against China, because I recall that there was that announcement of those hypersonic missiles that were being test launched out of China fairly recently. That kind of scares me to think we have, then what real defensive mechanisms do we have against a missile attack at this point in time?
Yes, that's a good question. Our ballistic missile defense capabilities were designed for the rogue missile attack from North Korea or Iran. It was not designed for an intercontinental class ballistic missile from China or Russia. Absolutely no defenses against it. I don't know about the Chinese. The Russians have better defenses against our Minuteman III than we have against their latest missiles. They're able to negate the Minuteman III. The only advantage we have is that they will run out of bullets to shoot our Minuteman III down before we're able to hit some of their targets. That's why we carry so many missiles. They're like something like 450 warheads on Minuteman IIIs in our silos right now. And so they will run out of bullets before we run out of our missiles. So that's what we have against them. Obviously, the trick is not to go to that point, not to go to World War III, but it's there as a deterrent, and it's worked for decades. Against China, we're more worried about not them attacking the U.S., continental U.S., but are ships at sea. So they have ballistic missiles without nuclear warheads. They have conventional warheads that were designed to attack aircraft carriers, not with nukes, but with just a lot of high explosive warheads. And so their missiles are able to do that. And they have a satellite system designed to detect all of our battle groups in all of our oceans. So they can, at any minute, they know where everything is at, all of our stuff is at sea, and they can calculate their fire control solution to the minute. If they go and launch against us, they know exactly where we are at, and we have no defenses against a ballistic missile launch at a ship.
Well, that's really comforting. Yeah, that's great. I'll be sleeping well tonight.
Aegis is fairly good. Aegis was designed for aircraft, against bombers and aircraft, and cruise missiles. And that's what it's good for. It was never designed for ballistic missiles, and they're developing the Standard Missile 3 variant for ballistic missiles. And they're also designing or retrofitting for Standard Missile 2. There is a version of it designed for ballistic missiles that is now deployed, but they're designed for North Korean missiles. They're very effective against North Korean missiles. Because I mean, the North Korean missiles, they do us a favor, they fall apart in flight before they reach targets. But if they ever build missiles, North Korea, they're too slow in order to hit us effectively. We're able to track them and then be able to attack them with our anti-ballistic missiles. And we're taking that Aegis Navy system and putting it ashore. It's called Aegis Ashore. And there's a big debate whether we should deploy it to NATO, because that has a chance of hitting some of the older Soviet era missiles still in the Russian inventory. Mm. But some of these hypersonic missiles, they fly at Mach 5. That's what hypersonic means, Mach 5. These ballistic missiles, they're flying at Mach 23 plus, and there's nothing that can hit them. And they'll start screaming in, and they maneuver at that speed, and you can't hit them. We don't have anything other than electro-optical directed energy weapons, and that's why we're developing those. Wow. They might be our only defense, whether we can array them in space. There's treaties about putting weapons in space, but these are like quote unquote defensive weapons. So there might be a loophole in the treaty that allows us to do that, but directed energy is the way to go in order to hit anything like that.
Wow, fascinating. Well, maybe we'll have to have you back to talk about some of those topics as well.
It won't be Cold War; it's post-Cold War though. But you can call this Cold War II.
Exactly. Well, listen, I don't want to belabor things. I want to thank you again. This was fascinating. I always enjoy your talks. Enjoyed your talk last year. This was great as well. And, definitely would love to have you back for another topic. So want to thank you again, and thank everyone, and join us in August for our next webinar. So thanks, everyone. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
All righty. Bye-bye.